And we were talking to Dutch design professionals. And one of the things that we were talking about was the kind of differences and similarities and contrasts between Dutch design and British design. And how, why they're significant. And it occurred to me actually that one of the significant things is this very thing that we're looking at here, which is the flag. Okay? Britain doesn't really do flags. The Dutch do flags. Scandinavia, I was in Sweden the other week, right? They do flags, they're good on their flags. Finland, there's a flag in every garden. Same as Norway. Who here is from the United States? You do flags? Yeah. You're big on flags. You have flags in classrooms. Anyone here from France? He said knowingly. You're pretty good on, you're not good on flags. Not as good as the Americans, not as good as the Scandinavians. The Dutch are great on their flags. The Italians. Anyone here from Italy? Right, who haven't I mentioned that is proud of their flag? I mean, we're all proud of our flag in a weird kind of way, well, apart from the Brits, for reasons I'll explain. We don't do flags, other people do flags. Why? Because it's complicated. It's very, very complicated. The country that you've just landed in is complicated. It's like going in, suddenly you're a lodger with a highly dysfunctional family. Okay? And these people, sometimes they get out, sometimes they get on really, really well. Sometimes they're throwing plates at each other. Sometimes someone is banished, right, to rented accommodation. Then they're brought back into the loving bosom of the family. And no one quite knows who they are, what their place is. And that's because we don't know who we are. The Brits don't really know who we are. And we kind of, for 300 years, have sort of hung together with some rough notions of who we are. We don't even know what to call ourselves. At the United Nations, we are the United Kingdom. It says so. The ambassador of the United Nations is sitting there talking about world peace and stuff. There's a little sign that says United Kingdom. When someone's running around with an athletic track in the Olympics, we're Great Britain. We're not the United Kingdom. Football. Football. We're England. We're Scotland, we're Wales, we're Northern Ireland. But that's not the only countries that make up whatever this weird place is. Because, where are we geographically? 50 miles in that direction. 50 miles in that direction is this country, the Isle of Man. It is a separate country. It has its own government. All it does is it shares our foreign policy. Right? But it's its own country, its own tax regime and so forth. Then we nicked bits of France, right, call them the Channel Islands, and they're all separate countries. And it's not just Guernsey and Jersey. There's others as well. I can't remember. I'm not interested. Right, so you've got this plethora of different islands. The British Isles is the geographical definition of who we are. That's a political definition. That's a political definition, and so is that. But understanding design and innovation, and understanding why Britain became the first industrial nation, and there are lots and lots of reasons for that. But I would argue that one of the most powerful reasons for why Britain industrialised first, and why Manchester industrialised first, was because we have this regional identity that's far more important than the national identity. We have London, we have Midlands, we have Cornwall. Cornwall want to be independent. We have the southwest of England, we have North Wales and South Wales. You go to North Wales and start talking lovingly about Cardiff, and they'll tell you where to go, right? Because the rivalries are particular there. We've got the Northwest, but within the Northwest we've got two cities, right, that are fearsome competitors. We have Manchester and Liverpool, more about that later. We have the Northeast of England, we have Cumbria. Now, Scotland is a flag-waving country as part of the UK, right? It's proud of its flag for reasons I won't go into. Right, and it's Scotland wants to be independent. Well, 45% of the people in Scotland want to be independent. Oh, yeah. Well, slightly different sides of this debate here. I moved to Scotland about 10 years ago, and I thought, being English, I'd have some difficulty. And I have to say, apart from one encounter with an SNP councillor, I've had no anti-Englishness against me in Scotland at all, because the people in Scotland are fantastic, very tolerant. Within 2 days of moving to Scotland, I was in a meeting, and people lived in Aberdeen, which is the northeast of Scotland. People are saying, well, of course, the problems that we're faced with, all because of those bastards in the central belt. And I'm thinking, the Central Belt, isn't that something to do with boxing? Central Belt. And that's actually Glasgow, Edinburgh. So there's this rivalry between the Highlands and the Lowlands, or between the urban conurbation, the centre of Scotland and the rest of the country. These rivalries are really important. These rivalries are important for understanding the growth of Britain and its identities, and that comes out in all kinds of different ways. But there's something else that's really as important, possibly more important, in understanding the nature of how that drive for innovation has led to an inherent tension between two different approaches to design in Britain. And one, if you like, is the kind of corporate approach. It's the approach led by the Design Council, right? Government. As we will see, from 1832, the British government has always had a policy on design. Bizarre, you might think. Why have a policy on design? I'll explain why later. So the government has this notion, right? Design is good for the economy, right? We're going to encourage design because it will make us more competitive, it's important for our national identity, etc., etc. Industry have similar view. Design is important for competitiveness, developing products that people want. It's all about designing for desire, etc. A few words about industry. I used the term earlier on about post-industrial economy. And to some extent, it's a fair view of what's happened in the whole industrialised world since really the 1970s. We are the second largest motor manufacturing nation in Europe. It's employing far fewer people, but the importance of manufacturing has only been partly eclipsed. So the industries have become smaller as employers, but perhaps more significant as generators of wealth. And they've gone into more, if you like, higher added value areas. So our motor vehicle industry, we're not producing so much for the mass market any longer, but the middle and upper parts of those markets, but a massive manufacturer. And we can see the same thing in aerospace, where UK is still in aerospace. So industry remains important. Design and innovation within those industries remains important. Then we've got the Harry Potter economy. We're one of the biggest producers of motion pictures and television in the world. And that's partly because of craft skills, partly because Britain is really good at telling stories, right? It's part of our culture. We've always been a storytelling nation. All nations tell stories. It's fundamental to humanity. But somehow it's kind of woven its way into all kinds of political and social activity. So the so-called creative industries, again, are big drivers of economic growth and are very significant employers of design skills. I mean, we have, at Dundee, we have one of Britain's top animation courses, and I guess about half of our graduates every year end up in London or in South Wales working on the latest Star Wars film or Doctor Who, or movies like that. So a lot of the post-production work for Hollywood movies is done largely in London and the South East. So that is, if you like, the corporate drivers of design innovation, and that gives it a different character. But the other side of the coin, I find far more interesting, frankly, because this is design for rebellion. It's design for revolution. It's design that comes from the street. So, it might start in the realm of fashion, but it might end up in music, and it might end up in political campaigning. It might end up in an independence campaign. It might end up in punk music, etc. It's always been driven by a sense of idealism. Britain wasn't so big on Marxism. Marxism, important influence. Never a great, unlike France or Italy or Spain, Marxism never really took hold in the same kind of way. But radical Christian socialism, that's a different matter. So that notion of idealism and utopianism, William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. People heard of William Morris? Yeah. A little bit. Okay. So what we're going to look at over the course, Jesus, it's 10:30. Over the course of the next hour, I'm going to speed up a bit. is to look at the interplay of these two aspects and how they have ended up with a really, really interesting fusion, a hybrid of creative practice in Britain. And your job as a creative practitioner, as a designer, as an aspiring designer in the future, is to understand where you sit culturally and politically in relationship to that, and understand your own sense of history. And try and use this framework as a means of understanding your own personal cultural history of design. History is probably the most important subject that we teach kids in school, because if we don't know where we've come from, if we don't know where we've been, we don't have a clue on where we're going. Am I right? Yeah? I mean, there is no way on earth that we can figure out what we want to do in the future if we don't know what's happened in the past. And all we can do is replicate the errors and mistakes of the past. So history is vital. History teaches us all kinds of lessons. That's why we're going to go back into history. We're going to go back to 1730. We're going to come up to 2015. We're not going to stop off at every year along the way, otherwise we'll be here till Sunday. We're going to look at these 6 very big themes about thinking big, designing social change, designing the public domain, designing the centre, designing for desire, and designing experience. And how these interweave together as a means of making some sort of sense of where design in Britain is today. And why areas like service design and experience design are really important, and also where they come from, and our relationship to the public, to other citizens, why that is fundamental to design practices. We may be working for corporations, and look, I'm not knocking corporations at all, but any creative or any professional practitioner has a number of different responsibilities. One responsibility is to their employer, one responsibility is to the people who use their design services, and the other responsibility is to themselves and their own morality and ethical judgment. Let's think big. Any idea who this guy is?
George Washington.
Sorry?
We were saying George Washington.
George Washington. I wonder where they come from. Not George Washington. He looks the same dad, actually, to some extent. Same sort of time. Same sort of time. Same sort of hair. I used to have hair like that, but I don't know what happened. And Josiah Wedgwood. He's my absolute hero of all time. And I'll explain why. Because he... The United Kingdom, ladies and gentlemen, the United Kingdom again. We're here. He was born there. Stoke-on-Trent is about 14 miles, 60 kilometres south of Manchester. And he was born into a family of potters. And what potters were supposed to do was to pot. They had potter's wheels that operated by a treadle, and you sat there and would pot all the time. His problem was, at the age of 8, he contracted polio, right? And he couldn't use his legs. But this was the age of the Enlightenment. He was born in 1730. It's the age of the Enlightenment, the age of chemistry, of physics, of the sciences, of understanding materials, of technology. We were beginning to have mastery over materials and technology. Right? As a boy, he was excited by this. And he was excited by looking at different ceramic bodies. How do you get colour into ceramics? How do you put relief pattern onto it? He became the first designer. He became the first person to disentangle the making of something from its conceptual design. Okay? And he had to do that because he couldn't make anything, because he had polio. So he became a designer, and he became a scientist, and he became an innovator. And he started creating this incredible work. And thinking, right, the age of the Enlightenment, the age of the new merchant class. What were the merchant class doing? Oh, they were hanging out in London and Paris and New York, Washington, places like that. And what were they doing? Oh, they were drinking tea, right? So they'll need teapots, they'll need cups and saucers. I'm the person to make those cups and saucers of a design never seen before. Okay, but if you're a craft maker, right, you can only make very small quantities of things, right, and it's difficult to get them to the market. So you have to build up your scale. So he built the world's first factory in Stoke-on-Trent. This isn't the world's first factory, but it would have looked something about this. I'm cheating here a bit. Right, so if you build a factory, the first factory in the world, what do you instantly create?
Jobs.
Jobs. And if you're creating jobs, you create the working class. Because the working class didn't exist before, right? So you had craft makers, and you had people who lived a subsistence agrarian lifestyle. if you correct the working class. Now, he was a Quaker, a radical Christian. And he thought, okay, these people, I'm employing them. So I have to give them good places to live. So he brought in basic but comfortable accommodation for the working class that had proper sanitation, etc. Shame not all employers did that, but there you go. So that's what he brought in. He brought in factory production, but he was making cups and saucers in the middle of England, right? We didn't have railways and we didn't have roads. They hadn't been invented yet. We hadn't invented tarmac. We had horses and carts, and the market was in London. If you put a load of cups and saucers on the back of a horse and cart and you drive it across fields, well, you're there ahead of me, aren't you? Really, right? So what do we next have to invent? Oh, let's invent a canal system, shall we? Let's invent mass transportation for industrial product. So he paid for the canal that would link up eventually London, Stoke-on-Trent and Manchester. He was born a craft potter who had polio. He became the first industrial designer, and he invented the industrial system. He thought very big, because that's what designers do. You don't think small, do you? Why would you possibly think small? What is possibly to be gained by thinking on a micro level? You have to think on a bigger level, and you have to bear in mind the ethical responsibilities of your practice, like he did. But he went further than that, because the big obscenity of his age was slavery. And he felt very powerfully about slavery. Slavery was providing a lot of the wealth that Britain's industrialisation was based on, and he thought that was abhorrent. So he created, Am I Not a Man and a Brother, these ceramic badges which every fashionable woman in London should be wearing. This was the first political badge. He was a vigorous campaigner in the anti-slavery movement, and eventually that movement abolished slavery. His daughter went on to marry a guy called Charles Darwin. And he paid for Charles Darwin to get a ship. But I think you're ahead of me there. So, Josiah Wedgwood, he's my hero. Because, yeah, he didn't quite invent the theory of evolution and DNA and all that kind of stuff. But he allowed it to happen. He accelerated that process. He accelerated the progress of science. And his was a very ethical notion of capitalism. And his was also a remarkably fantastic demonstration of how design thinking can change the world in a positive way. He also invented modern marketing, just as a little aside. Buy one, get one free, or bog off, as we call it in Britain. He invented it. Most of the techniques that Tesco used, he invented. Because it was all about connecting with this new consumer. We didn't have consumers until Wedgwood came along. How do you segment markets, and how do you reach markets, and all that kind of stuff. Direct mail. Right, someone else who thought big is Bauer House. Big chains, big hats, big bow tie, big man. Oh yes, indeed. Bauer House was a design engineer. A little bit after Wedgwood, but again it's about thinking big. One of his first jobs was to build the railway between London and Bristol, about 110, 120 miles apart. It's a remarkable railway, because it's more or less a straight line from London Paddington Station to Bristol Temple Meads. And the reason it's a straight line is because it has the longest tunnels and the longest bridges of any railway track, probably anywhere in the world, really. Why? Because they're phenomenally expensive, are they not? Building bridges, when actually you could kind of go around a hill, or you could follow the contours up a bit. But no, he decided to build, and he had to then persuade people to pay for this, right? He had to persuade people to spend millions of pounds on something that didn't appear to be essential. Why was he doing it? Because his argument was, he wanted people, when they were in a train, to feel that they were floating above the landscape. He wanted to give the illusion that they were flying. He was designing an experience. I maintain that Brunel was probably the world's first experience designer, because he was much more interested in the experience that he was creating than solving the technical problem of how you get from London to Bristol. That's an easy one to solve. But along the way he had to solve some problems that no one else had solved before. I'm cheating again here. This isn't actually on that way. This is the first tunnel built under the Thames. But everyone said you cannot build a tunnel under a river, right? That is a disaster waiting to happen. So he did it. And then he did it again. And they're still in use. They're still part of the London Underground system. So he was great on tunnels, great on bridges, great on engineering, but great on this vision that you're doing all this not just to solve technical issues. We think engineers are a bit boring. I mean, don't we, honestly, in our heart of hearts, engineering is a bit boring. But it's not because engineering enables us to design human experiences that otherwise we couldn't imagine. That's what he did. Right, okay. So we've looked at engineering, we looked at ceramics, but the big enchilada of early industrialisation is this industry, is textiles. It's surrounding us, isn't it? Yeah, this building, 150 years ago, was packed with textiles. Right, it was where people came to buy textiles for their clothing factories. Same as that building over the road.
We still do.
So?
Still do.
Yeah. So, this is the heart of the textile industry. Manchester invented the modern world.
Okay.
And this isn't actually an exaggeration. Manchester invented the modern world. It was going to happen somewhere. We all say that Mancunians are particularly gifted. Well, they are very gifted, but it was going to happen somewhere. It just happened to happen here. It just happened to happen within about a 5-mile radius of where we're sitting. Because this was the big driver. This was the big industry. This was the industry that kicked off the Industrial Revolution. Okay, ceramics lit the fuse, but it was the textile industry that created the scale of it. Somewhere in this photograph is Hyper Island, Manchester. I don't know exactly where. Oh, hang on. There, I think. Manchester was the world's first industrial city. No other city had developed as an industrial city up until that point. Around about 1870, somebody, and I can't remember whom, it was an American actually, said that the 20th century would be dominated by 2 cities. Neither quite made it, to be honest, but they were contenders. Chicago and Manchester. For very similar reasons. They both had this huge hinterland. In Chicago's case, geographically huge hinterland, and it was a major port for serving that hinterland. And Manchester's hinterland was a hinterland of expertise and know-how. And that was what was generating a lot of its wealth. But Manchester was the world's first industrial city. And with that came lots and lots of things. As I said, with industry comes factories, with factories comes the working class. With the working class comes an aspiration for a better life and a sense of justice. That's where all those ideas of politics have always come from. They don't come from the middle class, they don't come from government, they don't come from people in power, they come from people at the bottom. And the people right at the bottom were the people who worked in these awful, awful conditions. When you look at these fantastic buildings here in Manchester, you look at this one over the road, right? The detail and the brickwork, the angels and the architecture, fantastic, aren't they? That was paid for by somebody. It was paid for by the sweat of some children somewhere in some mill. It was paid for by the lives of some women who didn't live much beyond the age of 30 because they were the sweated labour of this industry, right? It's those ordinary families that paid for this incredible architecture and this incredible city that we enjoy today. But by August 1819, they'd kind of had enough, really, of the sense of injustice. And there was a big demonstration in St Peter's Fields, St Peter's Square, which is built on its site. It was about a mile in that direction, the other side of Chinatown. And the cavalry were called out. There's a dispute about how many people were killed. Somewhere between 15 and 20 people were killed, and over 600 people were injured. This is a defining moment in the history of democracy in Britain, possibly in Europe as well. And, you know, things like the French Revolution had been hugely inspiring, and indeed the American Revolution had been hugely inspiring to the democratic movement. But this led to a number of things, this massacre here. So it was important for British democracy. Probably, again, it lit the fuse for what was going to happen. And it led directly to The Guardian. Bear with me on this. So The Guardian was launched about 2 years after the massacre. The Guardian of Values, the Manchester Guardian of Values. It was originally called the Manchester Guardian. Those of you who are new to this country will know that there's a derogatory term. Oh, you're a Guardian reader. You know, for all liberal. I am a Guardian reader. I wouldn't describe myself as a woolly liberal. I'm a Guardian reader, and I always will be, because that is the paper that supports democracy and people. It's not owned by a corporation, it's not owned by a very, very rich person, it's not owned by a political party. It's owned by a trust, and people pay money into that trust. So every year I pay 120 quid to be a member of the Guardian, and other people do it as well. I very rarely read the Guardian. I don't have time to read a newspaper, maybe a couple of times a week, right? But this is a newspaper born in Manchester, very different from most other newspapers in Britain today. It's the third most widely read newspaper in the world in terms of its digital edition, and it won the Pulitzer Prize last year along with the Washington Post because of its fantastic journalism on the Edward Snowden story. So that's another thing that comes out of Manchester, and this notion of journalism, responsible journalism for people. Okay, 1830. Right, I was talking about Liverpool, Manchester. Liverpool was a slavery city, and Manchester was the cotton city. Right, and they were both, getting advantage from the British Empire in different ways, but fierce rivals. So it was strange to an extent that in 1830 the first steam passenger railway in the world was built between these two cities. So that was very important for moving people around. Now 2 weeks ago, I was flying over Manchester and I realised I had this talk to give. And I looked out the window, our plane was directly over Manchester, and as I looked out of the window, okay, there's Liverpool here, and then there's this line, which is the Manchester Ship Canal. Because the thing that was impeding Manchester's growth was the fact that Liverpool was the port. Everything had to land in Liverpool, because Manchester was land-bound. You know, it was miles from the sea. So, let's build a canal. Let's bring the sea to us. So all the docks in Salford, which is now a media city, that enabled Manchester really to take off and become what some historians have called Cottonopolis. Anyone here from Australia? Well, you know the significance of this. That in Australian and New Zealand department stores, bed linen is called Manchester's.
I left when I was quite young.
Right, okay. If you should go back and be in the market for some bed linen.
Okay.
Right, so the signs in department stores say Manchester's. You know, you say, what, Manchester's? Bed linen is because anything made in cotton was known as a Manchester. Right? So connected was this material, was this industry with Manchester. Okay, I was talking about the democracy movement, the working class, Marx and Engels. So, because it was the world's first industrial city, Manchester was the future. If you wanted to know what the future of the world was like, you went to Manchester. So Karl Marx and Fred Engels went to Manchester. Fred Engels, because he was running a textile mill here, strangely, and Karl Marx, because he was his pal, and was also working on Das Kapital at the time. But Frederick Engels wrote one of the finest works of Marxist literature, which is The Condition of the Working Class in England, which is an amazing account written in 1840-something about how ordinary people lived in Manchester. And it's not actually a political book in the sense that it's making a political point. It's just simply observing how people lived. So if you really want to know how the working class in Britain lived in the 1840s, either read Charles Dickens to get some idea from a fictional account, or Fred Engels. So arguably, if it wasn't for Manchester, would we have had Marxism? I don't know. But we probably would have done. But it would have maybe taken a slightly different form. Right, so that gives you that was my Manchester bits that I've come. That's why Manchester's important. That's why Manchester's really, really important, significant in the history of the world. Lots of different things happened here. So as you spend the rest of your time in Manchester, enjoy this place. Go into the museums, go into the art galleries, have a sense of where this place has come from. Have a sense of where this place is going to. Have a sense of where the design opportunities are, where the opportunities are for the people. Have a sense of, the political and community movements here in Manchester. Many of them have links with the design community as well. You get a sense of, why the city's evolved in that particular way. Right, 1832. Sir Robert Peel was the Prime Minister. He was born near Manchester, so he was a sort of Mancunian. He invented the police force. some people in Britain call the police bobbies, and that's after Bob Peel. He didn't invent the police force, he kind of professionalised it and spruced it up a bit. But I don't remember him so much for that. I remember him for standing up. Well, I don't remember, I wasn't alive at the time. But in the House of Commons in 1832, he stood up because he had a grudge with the French. Right? And that's another defining thing about British culture, is that, you're from France, yeah? We have a friendly rivalry across that 20 miles of sea. No, we're great pals with the French. But historically, we've had our ups and downs, as all neighbours do. We were the first industrial nation, but he stood up in Parliament and he said, the French textile industry is the best in the world. Their design is better than anything. We're producing tons and tons and tons of it. We're producing more than the French. But theirs is somehow, it's a little bit elegant. There's a little bit taste, you know what I mean? And why is this? It's because we, the British, have no taste. We don't have a design good. So this is the first time someone stood up in Parliament and talked about design. And talked about taste. Now he did two remarkably important things. This comes back to that top part of, sort of corporate design. Two really important things that were to determine what then happened for the rest of our history, actually. He decided one thing that impaired us was that people had bad taste. How do people get good taste? You show them what good taste is. So he set up a museum which became the Victorian Albert Museum, the world's first ever museum of design and craft. So here you would see well-designed, well-crafted objects, and you could walk around for free and say, oh yes, those Greek things which we stole from the Greek they look fantastic. Oh, that's good taste. I'll have some of those in the living room later. Make it a bit smaller. Put on a plate design. Right? So people could go and get inspiration and stuff. And shortly after that, the National Gallery in London, where people could go and enjoy paintings. Remarkable. Before that, no one else, ordinary people, even working class people, could go in and they could look at a Gainsborough. So it's exposure of people, to ordinary people, to design and art to give them good taste. Then he set up what became the Royal College of Art, what was called the Government School of Design. And that was the first building block in a whole national network. Of course, it wasn't called a network then, we hadn't invented networks in the Victorian era, of design schools. So we had, from 1832, we had the London Government School of Design. That was the first one that became the Royal College of Art. The second one, any ideas?
Glasgow.
Well, you would say that, wouldn't you? Yeah. Manchester, ladies and gentlemen, just a year afterwards. So the Manchester School of Design, which is now Manchester Met University, was the second one. And then they were popping up everywhere. And of course they took on the characteristics of the local industry. So in Birmingham, they kind of specialised in jewellery, because that was their thing in Birmingham. Did other stuff as well, but jewellery, still today, the School of Jewellery in Birmingham is great reputation. Stoke-on-Trent, of course, for ceramics. Sheffield for metalwork, or cutlery and stuff like that. Leeds for textiles. Glasgow, finally. Textiles and other stuff as well. And there were lots of others, Dundee came maybe 30 years afterwards, Aberdeen, etc., etc. The Central School in London, which specialised in graphics and print, etc. So this gave us a great design character and great design expertise, and historically always enabled us to produce far more designers than our economy would ever need. We can churn them out every year. And that gives us a massive, massive significance. I'll talk about that later. So shortly after that, we decided to celebrate our industry with the Great Exhibition of 1851. This massive crystal palace, this glass palace, was built in Hyde Park. Huge exhibition of the best of British industry, right? Everything that you could possibly buy. This is the biggest, it was the first trade exhibition the world had ever seen, right? Packed with stuff. Was it popular? 6 million visitors, a third of Britain's population turned up to the Great Exhibition. And what do they see inside? Stuff like that. And as one critic of the time said, the first industrial nation had inevitably achieved another first, namely the embodiment of poor taste and dubious quality in cheap consumer goods. It was awful. It was bad design. But on a grand scale, you know, I mean, this one of these chairs made of metal and just horribly made. So we weren't quite there yet. Partly as a reaction to that, and also bubbling up through these art schools, or design schools as they were properly known at the time, was a movement called the Arts and Crafts Movement, led by William Morris. He said many things in his long life, but probably this kind of nails the core of his philosophy. Have nothing in your homes that you know not to be beautiful. That was his slogan. And William Morris came from, again, he wasn't a Marxist, he came from that radical British Christian socialist perspective. And Arts and Crafts stood for traditional craftsmanship using simple forms often applied medieval, romantic or folk styles of decoration. It advocated economic and social reform based on socialist principles. So it was a political movement, but it was important, it was a design movement. Now some people latterly have criticised, and I've been as guilty as this as many people, criticise arts and crafts for being a little naive and say, well, you know, it's kind of going back to this medieval idyll of people giggling, swinging around maypoles, folk dancing, and way, hey, into the night. When actually they're impoverished and they were dying of horrible diseases by the time they were 6, you know. And so he's had a bit of a mixed legacy, but probably on balance it's a very positive legacy, in part because it's saying, actually, design is about social values. Design always embodies social values. When we design something, we capture the view of the world that we want to have. Right? Design is something that does that. And design does that in a better way, or not in a better way, but in a different way to anything else, in that it turns it into a physical object. And the physical objects that he created included books. News from Nowhere is a most remarkable book. It's a fiction that he wrote. It's like a science fiction. It's about what would the socialist utopia be like? How would people live? How would they work? Another one of his slogans is useful work, not useless toil. He was saying, look, you know, in this industrial age, people are toiling. They're doing useless stuff. But there's nothing bad about work. There's lots of bad things about toil, but work is good. We feel fulfilled. We feel refreshed after we've done it. You know, you work hard. I hear you work hard. And I'm sure you do. You know, working late. And at the end of that, you might be knackered. It's a British term that means highly exhausted. You might be highly exhausted, but you'll feel good. You'll think, God, that was a good day. Don't you? Yeah, that's part of the joy that you get from good work, as opposed to useless toil. So this is a beautiful book, and this original one he had decorated and he printed. I mean, he'd done the full thing and he published it and so forth. But he's best known as a pattern designer, and again, it's looking at naturalistic form. It's bringing a sense of nature, the joy of the world, and so forth, into people's living rooms. So a great designer of interiors. Before you leave Britain, go to William Morris's house in East London. Absolutely joyous place where this photograph was taken, and I think that was taken as well. Absolutely incredible. His problem, though, his dilemma, it's always known as the Boris Dilemma, is that, to use his own words, he was pandering to the swinish luxury of the rich. Because he was creating all this fantastic stuff that was fulfilling a socialist ideal, but who could afford it? Well, actually, the rich. You know, people who worked in the mill were never going to afford this kind of stuff. You know, they weren't going to live in a house like that. So there was this kind of, this dilemma that lay at the heart of his practice. But that's not to deny the fact that he was a pretty amazing designer. So moving on from that, moving into the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th, we have a movement that's based on arts and crafts. Probably based on arts and crafts, but it's kind of pulled away from the politics of it. It's less into the radical socialism. And it's more taking the arts and crafts style, abstracting it a bit down, but creating this essentially modern interpretation of it. I say it's dropped the politics, still a strong sense of utopianism in what it was trying to do. And Charles Rennie Mackintosh, the great Scottish designer, and his wife, the two of them worked together as a great design partnership, did some fantastic interiors looking at lighting, decoration, furniture, and it was about this thing, how do you create a holistic sense of design, that you're not just a lighting designer or an interior designer or a furniture designer, but you do the whole thing together. His crowning glory was this building, Glasgow School of Art. And Glasgow School of Art was completed in 1909, and the centre point of it is this quite awesome library. And again, if you should visit Scotland, go and visit Glasgow School of Art. The huge sadness is that you can't visit the library anymore because last summer it burnt down. And we've lost one of the main achievements of that art movement. The street was full of art students in tears, absolutely beside themselves in tears, seeing their art school burn. So this is gone, and there's a debate about whether should it be recreated, and there's a good argument for that. You know, there's parts of Europe, like Dresden or Leningrad, St. Petersburg, that have been completely rebuilt faithfully. There's a great argument for that. There's another argument to say, come on, it's an art school. You know, he wouldn't have wanted to recreate it. What would he have done? What would he have done in the 21st century? If you brought him back, he'd have created something different. So, you know, let's do it in his spirit rather than just ape his style. Interesting debate. But beautiful. So, from 1909 we get into the First World War, and we get into the horror of the First World War. We're cantering through history now. You thought we were going to stick with the 1730s for a long time, didn't you? But it's coming up to 5 to 11, and we're already in the 20th century. Things are looking up. We'll speed through this really quickly. And so we got the First World War, where a whole generation of young men effectively were wiped out in Europe. But just before the end of that came this momentous event, which is the Russian Revolution. And the Russian Revolution was an inspiration particularly for people in art and design, and of course in politics, because it was about how do we create a different system. We've all lived under this one system that hasn't really served ordinary people particularly well. Let's try something else. Well, we all know what happened to that something else, so I'm not going to labour that point. But for a very short period of time, probably up till 1924, it represented something that was a viable alternative. If he hadn't dropped dead, and if Stalin hadn't taken over, things probably would have been very different, but alas, that happened. But probably the first thing to be inspired by the Russian Revolution was the Bauer House, and this notion of, okay, we now have the first socialist industrial country in the world. Okay, it wasn't really an industrial country, but it had aspiration. Walter Gropius set up the Bauer House in Germany. I said we're going to focus on British design, but you can't actually do it in isolation. There's events elsewhere in the world that help frame who we are. And this was, are you all familiar with the Bauer House? Yeah? Well, just in case you're not, I'll just quick. Manifesto. It's harder to design a first-rate chair than to paint a second-rate painting, and much more useful. I think we'd all agree with that, wouldn't we? Yes. Manual experience of materials is essential to the student of design. Experience at first combined to free experiment and then extended to the practical workshop. Yes, and even today in the 21st century, the craft of design is vital. You actually can't design in the abstract. You can't design just with a pile of post-it notes. It's impossible. There's that thing about getting dirty, right? And actually hands-on and making things and showing it to people. That thing that I showed you earlier with our counter-terrorist project. Making something. Nothing beats the hell out of making something with other people. It gets you to look at them in different ways, etc. Because we live in the 20th century, they were saying at the time, the student architectural designer should be offered no refuge in the past, but should be equipped for the modern world in its various aspects, artistic, technical, social, economic, spiritual, so that he may, sexist language, he may function in society not as a decorator, but as a vital participant. Kind of a bit of a kick here at William Morris and the arts and crafts, right? Let's forget all this notion about this nostalgia for medieval Europe. You know, we are in the 20th century. We use electricity, right? We're in the industrial system. We want to make the quality of life of people better. Right? We're not just going to make stuff for rich people. We're going to do stuff for the mass market. And in fact, when we see the impact of them on housing, on modernist design, they have had an impact. The Bauer House has had an impact. We'll get on to that now, the legacy. Modernist design, I guess, was the key thing to come out of the Bauer House. The foundation course. You know, at Dundee we have the last foundation course running in Scotland actually, but the notion of a foundation course, which is a creative diagnostic. So you do a bit of everything and you figure out what you're good at and where your passion comes from. That started off in the Bauer House. This fusion of art, craft and technology, right? Looking at it in a holistic way. We don't have these disciplines that are fragmented, but you pull everything together. And it led really to a philosophy of design education in the UK and elsewhere to a greater or lesser extent, particularly in the Netherlands and Germany and Scandinavia, which is really based upon its principles. So hugely important. So this was feeding into the world's biggest system of design education, which we had on this little island here in the UK. So that was all part of the mix as well. So we were looking at what was going on as the 20th century developed. Of course, the Bauer House closed down. It was closed down by the Nazis in 1933 and then eventually moved to the United States. It's reopened in Germany, but it's kind of a bit like, you know, reforming the Rolling Stones. They weren't quite as good as it was at the time, you know, but good, it's still on the road. So right, so that was what was happening in Europe. In America, something else was happening. Right, the Russian Revolution had far less of an impact in the United States. What was having an impact there was cars. And this guy in particular, Henry Ford, and the launch in 1916, again before the end of the First World War, the Model T Ford. And I can't remember, but within 2 years, I think 40% of cars in the United States were Model T Ford. The motor industry was driving industry forward in the United States. And Fordism is a really good term to understand industry as it developed and was maintained throughout much of the 20th century. So an industrial system based on mass production. But for mass production to work, a number of things have to hold true. Everyone's got to want a standardised product because you can only make one product. Right? We're not talking about product diversity. We can only make one product, but we can make it cheaply or we can make it for everyone. And so some companies went to great efforts actually to create a mass market, like General Motors. They bought up the tram and bus systems in 30 American cities and closed them down. Right? So if you want to get to work, you had to have a car or take up running. And jogging wasn't a big thing in the 1930s. So that was important. And then 1929, a guy called Raymond Loewy, who was an industrial artist, and he had an office on Madison Avenue. And one day he went into work, he must have been in a grumpy mood or something, and he took off the sign industrial artist from his office door, put up industrial designer. And the rest is history, frankly. That's kind of where modern industrial design kicked off. But it was very much based around branding and selling and design for desire. And I think that's what American design has given the whole world design community a particular character. And that, again, has influenced what was happening here back in Britain. So we were, I suppose in Europe, we were into the philosophy of the Bauer House and all that kind of stuff, and truth to materials, etc. And in the United States, it was, okay, let's use design to sell stuff more effectively and actually create a narrative, create a story to wrap around something. We can maybe only have one fizzy drink, we can only have one car, but let's create a narrative around it, a kind of design fiction around it. So they're bringing another set of skills to it. Right. I'm not going to dwell anymore on American design. I'm going to come back to Britain. Because Britain was evolving in a slightly different direction. And I talked about in America closing down public transport. We were opening it up and developing it much more because in the aftermath of the First World War, we had to get the industry going again, we had to get the economy going again and people back to work. And public transport was one of the ways of doing that. Frank Pick, he's my second hero, really, after Wedgwood. Well, third, after her, of course. But Frank Pick, and he said, he was a design manager, and he said, design is intelligence made visible. And I think that nails it for me, right? Design is intelligence made visible. It encapsulates so many different things. It encapsulates your smart view of the world. the intelligence by which you've understood people, the intelligence by which you've understood the different options of things, the intelligence by which you have incorporated ethical issues into your design practice. But he was a solicitor, a lawyer by trade, and he kind of got this job as a design manager of the most complicated system in the world, kind of by accident. He fell into it. So he picked up quite quickly what design was. But he did it masterfully. So he was responsible for designing the most complicated system on the planet. And he had to make it really understandable for people to use it. And it was the London Underground. And again, it was this thing. He was responsible for this huge expansion of the Underground in the 20s and 30s. And he integrated typography into architecture. He would get the typographers and the architects and the interior designers to work together. We weren't working with a Charles Rennie Mackintosh who did the whole thing. We were working now with multidisciplinary teams. So I suppose multidisciplinary team working in design was born in the London Underground. And again, the London Underground, as far as I'm concerned, continues to inspire as really good design practices around interiors, around information design and so forth. So the stations are awesome. The interiors of the station, and it is showing a respect for people. I think that's the great thing about the London Underground. That, nothing is too good for ordinary people. Nothing is too good. We're not talking about private spaces here. We're not talking about, fancy homes for rich people. We're talking about places that people pass through to go to work, to do their daily toil. But nothing's too good for them. So they're turned into these palaces underground. And then we create probably the best map of all time. Frank Pegg also invented crowdsourcing because he said to his staff, look, we've got to design a different map because the map of the Underground was appalling. It looked like a cat's entrails. It's just awful. So, a guy who was an engineering draftsman, Harry Beck, came up with this. This was his first prototype. Most underground railways in the world use a version of this. And again, how do you distort real geography? The key thing about an underground railway is people have got to know where they are in relationship to what's up there, right? Where everything looks the same. So you've got to create stories underground. You've got to create identities, and you've got to create a sense of place. And they've got to have in their heads, they've got to have a map they can remember, right? I've not lived in London for God knows how many years, right? But the modern version of that map is in my brain. I can tell you how to get from Arna's Grove to Stratford. Change at Euston, and then you change Tottenham Court Road. It's just there. All the information is there because I can see that map, right? And any Londoner can see that map in their head because it's a really easy picture to remember. But it wasn't just about, it was about designing an experience. It was saying, okay, right, we'll get you to work and we'll bring you home. Then what do you want to do? How about have dinner, see a show? Dinner and a show, yeah. Or go away for the weekend. So the line was deliberately taken out into the countryside so that people could go out into the country. And then he commissioned artists to create that story. So it's about storytelling, it's about narrative. It's getting people to just think, this is an experience. We're not just functionally getting from A to B. Why are we going to B? What B do we want to go to, right? And why were we at A in the first place? To travel more is to learn more. So there are always little messages put in. Travel, find out about yourself, find out about the world. Do that through design. And so it's about public space. Public space is a really important aspect of British design. This is my city, Dundee. This is the heart of the city. This is McManus Gallery. And the McManus Gallery was created by an architect called George Gilbert Scott, who was a fantastic architect. And I always think of the McManus Gallery as a little sketch for a bigger thing that he did. Which is this, which is St Pancras Station in the middle of London. And in fact, if you go back, like the windows, these things on the roof, that's the small version, and that's the big version. Now, so he was a fantastic architect because again, it was about nothing is too good for the public. Well, you create these fantastic spaces where they can, here, what is St Pancras Station, built in 1840 something? It is a celebration of technology. Right, we've created the world's first railway system. Let's celebrate it with this thing. This is how to travel, ladies and gentlemen. And this design is this big symbolic celebration of what we're doing. Right. Now, he was good. His grandson, ladies and gentlemen, was even better. Well, he had a son who was a pretty good architect, but his grandson really went to the town. And his grandson has left us with some of the most iconic architecture that we have in Britain. Giles Gilbert Scott specialised on stuff like power stations. Right, he said, what can you do with the power station? Honestly, what can you do with the power station? Right, the power station that became the Tate Modern Art Gallery on the south bank of the Thames in the centre of London was one of his. This is even better. It's lain empty for decades, but they're now doing it. But it's become iconic in our rock and roll culture, as some of the older people might remember. None of you remember, actually. It's completely lost on all of you, isn't it? Pink Floyd, ring any bells to anyone? Yeah, Pink Floyd, yeah. So that was the cover of Pink Floyd, Flying Pig. Yeah, right, good. Excellent. Now, he went on from that to do the Anglican Cathedral in Liverpool. Now, the Anglican Cathedral in Liverpool is fantastic. It's this great brick structure. Think about that form. Then he got a gig after this, which is, right, we want you to design something that's a bit smaller than that. So he kind of stripped that design back down and made the phone box. So, I was asked to write a piece by a Scottish architecture magazine recently about my favourite Scottish building. And I thought long and hard about this. I nearly did them at Manus Gallery, and I thought, no, I'm going to do the phone box. Why? Because this is created by a guy who did cathedrals, and these are little cathedrals of conversation, right? And they say so much actually about British culture, about we want privacy, or now we take out our phone and we shout, yes, I'm on a train. But then you went into a little room, almost like a confessional. You dial a number. You don't remember dialing, do you? Right? Key and you talk, right? So there's something very kind, almost religious, about communicating to somebody far, far away. And the fact is, and I saw it even as a kid, I could never get my head around this, but it was a wonderful notion that in an old-fashioned phone box, under analogue technology, there was a physical connection between you and the person that you were ringing. So when I was ringing my gran, I knew that there was actually a wire, right? It was all linked up. There was a piece of metal that joined me and my gran, who was the other side of the country. Right now, with mobile phones, there's nothing. It's something up here. It's the atmosphere. And so the phone box becomes iconic. So I chose that because it's also something that's quintessentially British. You have it everywhere. You have it from Aberdeen to Aberystwyth. You have it from the Shetland Islands to Shadwell. You have it everywhere in Britain. And it's something, again, it's something that symbolises the value that we have in ordinary people. But again, like Battersea Power Station, it becomes part of our popular culture. If we look up close, we can see it everywhere. David Bowie, ring any bells, ladies and gentlemen? Really not. But anyway, so... right, so again, so we ruthlessly exploit physical design in the UK to create stories, actually, and to use those as selling things about how quirky Britain is. Anyone recognise this box? No?
TARDIS?
It's a TARDIS, well spotted. Who has heard of the term TARDIS? Okay, so most of you haven't heard of the term TARDIS. I'll give up, frankly. So, a TARDIS. This was developed in the 1930s, I think, as a police phone box. So, if you were on the streets and suddenly, oh my God, I've lost my wallet, I'd run to the nearest police box. I'd go in, I'd shut the door behind me, I could lock the door behind me, I'd phone the police, I've lost my wallet. And or if there was a gang chasing you down the street, right? You think, oh my God, there's a police box. I can get inside it and close it behind it and be safe. Mind you, these police boxes were made of wood. So if the gang had axes, you'd be in real trouble, honestly. And so this is someone called Doctor Who. Right? Doctor Who is the longest running TV drama in the world. It started, I remember the night it started. It was a long time ago. In the early 1960s, November 1963. And it's been going ever since. And of course the actor has to change. So it's this Time Lord, he travels through time and space. If you want to know the difference between American and British culture, you sit down go on Netflix and watch Star Trek, and then watch Doctor Who. And, okay, Star Trek is about boldly going when the man's gone before. Okay? I am an American explorer. Oh, this is my Russian friend. And, oh, Scotty. She's not going to hold, Captain. No, she's not going to hold. But it's this hero. This is noble hero. Captain James D. Kirk, Starship Enterprise. Right? And you kind of think, yeah, he's a hero, he's a real hero. And the guy with the funny ears, he's a hero as well. He's obviously from somewhere in Kansas, but you know, for the ears, make different. And now Doctor Who is this sad bastard. Right? He's lonely, he's been drifting for hundreds of years, right? He makes friends with people. He can't make friends with people for so long because they'll die before he does. So he has to kind of, you know, when he left Rose, there wasn't a dry eye in the country, was there? I mean, he left her in a different dimension. Just otherwise his heart would break. His heart would break. And he's got baddies, right? They got the Klingons, right? But the Daleks, but he can never really kill the Daleks because he can't kill anyone because he's a good person. But he's bound between being a good person and saving the universe. Oh, it's all so difficult. He's a lonely bastard. And that's the difference between Americans and Brits, in a nutshell, basically. But narratives, stories, don't they? They kind of tell you differences about national characteristics. So if you kind of want to understand something about this weird island that you're on, have a few views of Doctor Who. Peter Capaldi's the latest Doctor Who. Spookily, everything in this lecture ties together because he used to be a student at Glasgow School of Art. He would have used that library you saw earlier. A fantastic actor, absolutely brilliant actor. Public transport also saved London in an extent, and this was in the war. And it was where people used to hang out when the Nazis were bombing London. So it was kind of something that saved us. Right, we're now into the middle part of the 20th century. Institutions, the BBC. BBC was set up in the late 1930s. And the BBC is really important for British design for reasons that I'll come back to in a few minutes. The BBC is important, and so is the NHS. So two really important institutions. NHS today is probably one of the biggest users of design in Britain. I do a lot of work I do through my consultancy and research I do at the university is for NHS or people who are associated with the NHS. And we're very proud of it. Right. 1951, 100 years after the Great Exhibition, we had the Festival of Britain. Okay, we were war-torn, we had this huge national debt that it would take us decades to pay off after the war, but we had a sense of optimism. We had free health. Okay, we had public sector broadcasting, we had television. We were just about to get a new queen, who's been there ever since. I don't think she's ever going to die. Good luck to her. I mean, she's great, fantastic one. And all that sitting, posing for the stamps and coins, that's retiring. So, the Festival of Britain, where we saw a whole new approach to design. We saw this very vibrant design taking place. Design for the modern age, design for the 20th century. Bringing in movements from artistic practice into stuff for the mass market. Textiles by Lucian Day. There was also stuff in there by David Mellor. He was a graduate of the Sheffield School of Art. And Sheffield, of course, is the cutlery and steel capital of Britain. At one stage, it was responsible for 70% of the world's tonnage of steel. Not anymore. But David Mellor was remarkable, sadly dead now. My cutlery at home was designed by David Mellor. It was beautiful cutlery, lovely balance. He really knows how to design a knife and fork. That was his Pride range in 1953. And he designed bus stops. So he designed, and this is the interesting thing about that generation, the post-war generation of designers, is that they felt a need to do stuff for the public domain and the private domain. So he designed every bus stop in the 1950s, in Britain. And he designed the traffic lights. And still, the basic design of the British traffic light goes back to this expert in cutlery design from Sheffield. He was an art student, or design student rather, but he carried on with the ecclesiastical silverware. So it's that sense that design practices, and I'd say this to all design students, never restrict yourself to one area, never ever pigeonhole yourself. right? Always take on different practices, different challenges, as many side projects as you can, as time will allow, because that exposes you to different opportunities and different ways of working in design. We hit the 60s, and we've got Terence Conran who's leading this retail design revolution, and to some extent a branding revolution as well. Napoleon described Britain as a nation of shopkeepers. And to some extent he was right. Retail has always been a driving force in British design and accounts for some of its characteristics. So the 60s saw this birth of modern retailing that had a profound impact on retailing elsewhere in Europe. Something else happened in the 60s that was vital. Right, I said a few minutes ago, well, it seems like hours ago now, frankly, doesn't it? But I said a few minutes ago that one of the great things about art and design education in Britain is that we produce far, far more artists and designers than we could ever employ. Like thousands and thousands more than we could ever employ. And every so often, some right-wing politician will get up in the House of Commons and say, we should be producing less, far less of them, because it's taking public money. Public money, we don't need this, do we? We don't need all these designers being idle and unemployed, all these artists. And my response is, yeah, fine, we could reduce it, just the simple number that are absorbed by industry. We'd never have had the Beatles. We wouldn't have Harry Potter. We wouldn't have Coldplay. Well, actually, that's an advantage. Anyway, so two of these guys went to an art school, right? And so they had that art school sensibility. And a lot of the bands in the 60s were art school bands, the Cream, Kinks, the Who, etc. And so art schools were producing this incredible creative talent. Design schools were producing this incredible creative talent, which was finding this new outlet. And part of that outlet was created by something that was created by official Britain, but of course it was run by people who had a slightly different agenda, thinking, great, there's something absolutely fantastic happening out there, and actually most young people can't hear it, so let's put it on the BBC. So in fact the biggest collection of recordings of the Beatles are the BBC's own tapes. I think they produced 4 CDs so far of the Beatles at the BBC. So the BBC has been really important for the development of culture in Britain. It's fashionable at the moment, it's not the BBC for all kinds of reasons. Without the BBC, we probably wouldn't have the pop music culture that we have today. Something else we wouldn't have, just briefly while we're on it, the BBC in the 1980s introduced the BBC Micro. Every school in the country had BBC Micro. Do you remember the BBC Micro? You're a bit too young for the BBC Micro. And, yes. And sometimes she looks at me in that way. I think, oh God, trouble later. And, right, so you had a whole generation from about 1982 of kids going to school, and when you put this on, you had that little triangle, right? So you could only speak to this machine in code. So you had a whole generation of kids that learned to code. And then they figured out, once they'd learned to code, we could play a game on it. Without the BBC Micro, none of that. Literally none of that. We're the third biggest computer games producer in the world. That wouldn't exist without the BBC Micro at all. It simply wouldn't. Because you were infusing that culture of coding, which sadly now has been lost in secondary education. Back to the Beatles. So the Beatles were important for culture, for British identity, for stimulating design in fashion, in film, etc., for bringing back the animation industry that was more or less dead. And one of their movies brought it back spectacularly. And then going back into the art schools, working with people like Peter Blake at the Royal College of Art in creating a design look for this new popular culture, of a psychedelic culture that they were creating in the late 1960s. So that whole thing about music is fundamental to understanding the design culture of Britain, and it's fundamental for understanding what all these otherwise unemployed design students would be doing. We're talking about music. We were talking earlier about Manchester, and I just wanted to slip this in. How many of you like British modern music? Rock music, dance music, pop music? Yeah. It's interesting. The geography of music goes back to this thing about different areas. Like in the Industrial Revolution, every part of the country had its different strength, and we're also vigorously competitive with each other. And it's exactly the same with pop music. Right? Bristol. lovely city, beautiful city. Love to live there one day. Right, they've kind of got this trip-hop scene that's been going on for about 20 years or so. Tricky, Portishead, Massive Attack, fantastic. London, the music scene's a bit bigger. We've got David Bowie, the Stones, Sex Pistols, the Clash, big on punk and stuff, right? So, London. We got, well, I used to live, Sheffield, we got, that rise of electronic pop in the 80s. The Arctic Monkeys, of course, Pulp, one of the best art school bands of all time. The North East, slim pickings of the North East. After you get beyond Sting, Dire Straits and Brian Ferry, I'm afraid. Scotland, now we're on firmer ground there. Susan Boyle at the top of the list, sorry. The Proclaimers, Deacon Blue, Franz Ferdinand, Emily Sandé, Texas, The View, Fratelli, Biffy Clyro. Right, now, there's an interesting statistic that the northwest of England has something like 15% of the population of Britain. And is responsible for between 35 and 40% of all the top 10 hits in Britain between 1960 and 2010. And it makes sense when you look at it. Those are the bands from Liverpool, and those are the bands from Manchester. And so you've got a song, you start reading, okay, it gets a bit dodgy, take that. Some awesome, in Herman's Hermits, yeah, sorry. But then, brilliant stuff. Why? I've exaggerated a bit. I mean, there's some bands I've left out, but giving you an indication of the balance of music. Why do you think the northwest of England has got so much phenomenally brilliant music, but it's the quantity of it? Why? Something in the water, maybe?
The diversity?
Yeah.
The art schools.
Art schools probably have something to do with it. No, maybe no more than somewhere else. I think you're closest to it.
Maybe struggle, I don't know.
Sorry?
Struggle?
Struggle to some extent, because actually when a lot of these bands like the Smiths, the Fall, Joy Division, to use a crude technical term, Manchester for a long time was a shithole. Right? It was horrible. And I used to live close by. I used to live in Stoke-on-Trent, and Stoke-on-Trent was even worse, frankly. It had nothing going for it at all. Manchester's gone through this incredible renewal and renaissance, right? Immigration. These are port cities, right? They've always had a churn of people coming in and going out. Liverpool has got the oldest established Chinese community, Chinatown, in Europe. As we know, Manchester's got a big Chinese community as well. We've had people, the reason rock and roll started in Liverpool is because all the records were coming from America first. They would land in Liverpool and the kids would buy them, right? Before they came to London, they were coming into Liverpool. So it's that thing about immigration, and that's one of the hugely inspiring and wonderful things about Britain, is that it's open to people, and we have this cultural mix and this excitement that goes on, that in design and visual art and in contemporary music we actually see the result of that in this remarkable and inclusive creative thing. Anyway, moving on, where are we? Right, so yes, let's move into the 1970s. We've dealt with the Beatles and we've touched upon music, and we're going to talk about something else, which is this. Volume. Just take that.
You ever quit dance? You've been sitting here? Felt anything like
Sex Pistols.
and the seats over here, they like
Right. Punk was an art school thing. Came out of the art schools. And it was a really vibrant and important design, fashion and music movement in Britain. It brought together people who went on to become fantastic designers, like Vivienne Westwood. And she is a mainstream fashion designer responsible for turnover of tens of millions every year. But most importantly, it was allied to something that was very rooted in the street, right? Ordinary people doing stuff, in their bedrooms, and playing with a really amateurish but vital form of design. I was a punk in London, as you can see, during the late 1970s. And Yeah, I did buy, not the first issue, I think I bought the second or third issue of Sniffing Blue. God knows where it is. It'd be worth But that was one of the first things they published, and that was the whole spirit of punk. You know, this is a chord, this is another, this is a third, now form a band. And that was it, right? It was, you didn't have to go to music school, right? You didn't have to go to see a guitar tutor and learn an instrument for several years, as I did as a child, double bass. And but this was all about doing something in a hugely amateurish way. But into that kind of DIY culture came all these ideas from the radical events in Paris in 1968, the political events in Paris in 1968, the Situationists. Malcolm McLaren, who was an art school trained person, was looking at all this thing the Situationists were doing, how students had taken this art movement and turned it into a street movement, and thinking, well, you could do that, because in the mid-70s music was in a bad place, really bad place. Arena bands, you know, dreadful. And how do we create something that is more of the people, but is political, not party political, but is about challenging convention. And then, taking that DIY culture, remarkable designers like Jamie Reed came along, and then started tidying it up a bit, and then creating a look for it, particularly for the Sex Pistols. We're going to come back to Manchester for a really important part of the story, because in 1976 the Sex Pistols played the Free Trade Hall. The Free Trade Hall is built on the site of the Peterloo Massacre in St Peter's Square, on the side of St Peter's Square. And they played here. It's quite a small hall. The number of people who claim to have attended that gig probably number about 500,000. But what we do know for a fact, we know this for a fact, that all the members of the Smiths were there. They didn't know each other, but they were there. All the members of Joy Division were there. 3 of the Happy Mondays were there. Just about everyone who was there, who was really there, went off and created a band. Right? And that created that kicked off the Manchester music scene, which really had been there'd been a few things happening, but that was the birth of it in a big way. And you had the Smiths. And the Smiths were a Manchester band, a little bit more about Manchester now, a Manchester band, probably my favourite band of that era, simply because of the lyrics, the music, the way they used the guitar sound, and the reference to this is not Manchester. Look, when I say it was a shithole, I mean, I don't mean that as a derogatory comment of Mancunians or the city that they inhabited, but it was dirty, it was filthy, the jobs were unsafe, there was a high level of unemployment, there wasn't much to do in the evening. That was what I meant by that. And they were turning this into a wonderful art form. Right, so you've met him, haven't you?
Yes, good friends with touch.
Right. Malcolm Garrett. I went to Korea with Malcolm Garrett.
He's got long hair now.
Oh, his hair goes up and down like
It's a
that.
form of long hair.
Well, Malcolm and I ended up on a free gig with the Design Council off to Korea to sell British design to the Koreans. And he was the sexy number and I was the warm-up act. You know, so I do this is the theory of design, this is why it's very important. And then he'd come on and say, well, yeah, you know, as I was saying to Suggs from Madness the other day, I think, why do I bother? And I've seen him a few times since, and I gave him an honorary doctorate when I was head of an art school in Scotland. Great guy. Anyway, we were in the back of a taxi, and I was saying to him, how did you start as a designer? Specialising, because he specialised for about 20 years in music. And he did stuff for the Sex Pistols, ringing bells. No, not Sex Pistols, the Spice Girls. How can you confuse the Spice Girls? So he ended up doing the first interactive CD for the Spice Girls. And he'd done stuff for all kinds of people. And he kicked off with the Buzzcocks. I said, how did you start with the Buzzcocks? How did you start doing this? He said, right, the Buzzcocks, if we briefly go back, they were the support. Buzzcocks were the support. But after that gig, they decided that they wanted to brand themselves, right? And no punk. I mean, the Sex Pistols had started doing that by working with Jamie Reed, and he lived in a student flat with a guy called Howard Devoto, who was in Buzzcocks. And Howard said, "Can you brand us?" And he was a second-year art student at Manchester School of Art, as was Peter Saville. So he said, Peter, do you want to work with me on this? So there's a local punk band, they want me to brand them. How do we do it? And they thought, well, I don't know, how'd you start doing that? And they went to see, and then he confessed, he said, I never really liked punk. I said, what? Yeah, I much prefer Duran Duran. What? Anyway, I just skirted around that. I thought it's best to be polite with these kind of things. And then they asked themselves a question, so what does revolution look like? Because this was a revolution, punk was a revolution. So we're designers. What does revolution actually look like? We know what it sounds like, we know the clothes that they wear. But what does it look like? How do you design it? So they did what every good designer first does, which is...
Copy.
Sorry?
Copy.
Copy. Yeah. Well, sort of. No, research. And they went to the library. They didn't copy. They ended up looking at the Russian constructivists, as I said. The Russian Revolution was a wonderful period for about 7-8 years. And one of the things that it was wonderful on was design, graphic design in particular. So this was the kind of work coming out of Russia from the revolution in 1917 up to when Stalin killed off all the designers in the late 1920s. And the notion was, how do we design revolution? In this country that's never had a revolution before, how do we design revolution? So they were doing it. So they were thinking, right, okay, so this is how the constructivists did it. And it was all about playing with type and playing with colour and, form and taking motifs from industry. People hadn't done that before. This is, from textile production, turning it into nice repeat patterns. And that's what they did. So they weren't copying, but they were taking that as a starting point, and figuring out, okay, with the typography we've got today, with the photographic imagery that we've got today, how can we start playing around with type? Malcolm did typography at Reading School of Art before he came to Manchester, and his philosophy is actually any form of design you can reduce to typography. That's the basic foundation of it, and everything else follows from that, which is an interesting idea. So it's about how do you view revolution. Because this then turned itself, it came up from the street, it involved art students, but it became a big, big industry. And especially in Manchester. Peter Saville went on to work for Factory, which ran the Hacienda Club here in Manchester, Joy Division amongst the artists, Happy Mondays, etc. But he brought a completely different aesthetic to music design than Malcolm. Okay, where are we going with this? Now, so Peter then ended up, so after they'd done all this fantastic stuff for music, where does that take you as a designer? Well, it kind of takes you into a regular job eventually, yeah? Because that will never last forever. Though it's done some really, really interesting things along the way. Let's come back to what I was talking about earlier, about Britain's good at telling stories. Britain's good at telling stories. It's probably 70 to 80% of its design industry is based on corporate identity and retail design. And it's about selling stuff. And it's about creating a visual story that can instantly be communicated. Wally Olin, sadly now dead, his agency is responsible for all of these corporate identities: Orange, Shell, the 2012 Olympics, Tate, Akzo Nobel, Dutch company, Microsoft, etc. Peter Saville worked with them for quite a long time, I think. So corporate identity is really important. I'm mentioning that, I'm not going to dwell on that because I'm not that interested in corporate identity, to be honest. I'm interested in Manchester. Things always come back to Manchester. This is Manchester in 1996. You're familiar with this event? Do you know about this? Manchester's history? Yeah. So, just down the road at the Arndale Centre, a massive bomb went off. A truck was full of high explosives, and it went off. And this is the aftermath of it. This is a lot about British design, I think, the gunner bombs. I can joke about it because no one was killed, and I think the injuries were very slight. I hope I'm not wrong in saying that. My recollection is they were slight. Terrorism was different then, right? The police would get a phone call with an Irish accent saying, "All right, the bomb's going to go off in about an hour." right? And they knew that that would give you enough time to clear everyone out of the area, apart from one guy who was severely hungover after half a night before, who lived in a flat up here or something, and he woke up with a bit of a start, but everyone else had cleared from the area. But what that led to was this complete regeneration of the middle of Manchester. I remember about 10 years ago, a taxi driver taking me from one of the universities to the airport. As we were driving past the city centre, looking at all these trains everywhere, he said, you know, the IRA, best thing to happen to Manchester. And to some extent, he was kind of right in that it led to this modernisation of the city centre, which to some extent was needed. And I use this is kind of comes out of our design against crime stuff, because this is Selfridges, which is just down the road, and this is all designed so you can't drive a carload of explosives to pump, right? So you've got these bollards here, this is all design against crime stuff. You've got, if you drive a truck over this, then blades would come up and go through the tyres. You've then got the chicane course. If you watch someone on a motorcycle doing it, going up there, you have time to kind of ring up the police, do a bit of light shopping, come back, and they're still driving this motorbike, up and down the stairs. So everything's there for a reason, and they've got glass which has been laminated in situ. So even if you put a bomb on there, right, because it's laminated in situ, it's far less likely to splinter and injure people. So a lot of the things about designing against terrorism were kind of pioneered in Manchester because of that. Let's go back. We're cantering towards the end now. It's gone on slightly longer than I thought, but Vivienne Westwood, born near Manchester, another Manchester experience. Connection, rather. So Vivienne Westwood, I suppose, shows part of the completion of the story, which is how stuff from this radical part of design ends up in the mainstream. And these two cultures of design kind of influence each other. So that's Vivienne, that's me and Vivienne, but we'll move on swiftly. I haven't got time for my funny stories about Vivienne, but anyway, so this is, again, she's taken this really daring approach to fashion, to couture, but she has this absolute mastery over materials. A lot of her fabric is sourced from Scotland. She's got this huge thing about tartan, uses it in a lot of her work, Harris tweed, etc. So if we kind of take this, move it up to the middle, what can we say about Vivienne Westwood? She is, as we all should be, the point I made earlier, informed by history. So she knows where textile comes from, she knows where design comes from, and she has this sense of place, where she is as a designer, where she's come from, where her industries come from, and where the styles have come from. But she's focused on markets, right? If you don't understand consumers, you don't understand users, you don't understand markets, you can have the best design ideas in the world, but you're not going to earn a living from it. Okay, so you have to be able to locate yourself economically in a market economy. Crafting technology, absolutely understanding the technology, in her case, the technology of clothing. She's almost an engineer when she talks about tailoring. Her big thing is about tailoring, and she uses the techniques of, quintessentially English tailoring. That amazing mastery over how you put cloth together to create clothes. But radical. Okay, she's kind of dropped the politics now, but she uses it as a bit of a sideshow. But radical in terms of the design language that she's creating, and the whole approach to fashion. I'm going to move towards a conclusion and use another example of this thing about where these two worlds intersect and why the kind of cultural, music, art world and design world intersects with design to create something which might be mainstream, but we can see how it's influenced. There's a company called Tomato, design company that are based in London. And they do a lot of work. They do a lot of corporate identity stuff. This is stuff they did for an Italian furniture and lighting company. They do adverts for Citroen. They do TV commercials. This is for Volkswagen. So it's corporate identity, kind of experiential stuff. They've really gone sonics, and they make sonics into film. And they should be pretty good on sonics, quite honestly. Because the two people who are directors of Tomato, they do this, and start of the week. And this on the weekends. Because they're known as Underworld. So they're a top dance band that have always run a design company. And they bring those two worlds together. So they kind of intersect between these two spaces. And that's one of the really strong and distinctive aspects about British design, how the culture informs design and vice versa. And then also the public sphere comes into this. All these things in the lecture are being tied together as we speak, ladies and gentlemen, because Underworld did the music for the opening of the Olympic Games. And because the director of the opening of the Olympic Games worked with them on the soundtrack for Trainspotting, which was one of his notable movies, which is a very realistic view of everyday life in Scotland. Oh, at least when you did. And so this was 2012, the Olympic Games. And so Underworld were doing, they used lots of other people, but Underworld did all the music that stitched it all together. Because theirs is about a music that's based on experience. And I know the commentators in the United States were a bit mystified by this, because this has been beamed all over the world. NHS, what's this? Because we come back to this notion of the NHS. The NHS is, I said at the start, we don't do flags in Britain. No, we don't really do flags. Occasionally we do flags, Queen's birthday and the odd independence referendum that we might have. But otherwise, we don't really do flags. And Tony Blair once said to George Bush, he said, as a politician, you don't do God.
You don't do what?
Don't do God. Because American presidents, I went to church the other day and I'm a church, I'm a Christian. British prime ministers don't do that, right? They don't make a big thing about their religion. We don't do religion. We have two organisations, one's called the Church of England and the other's called the Church of Scotland. And they're kind of social clubs, right? They're not really, they don't do God, really, not hugely. We go along and have a sing-song and stuff. I hope I'm not offending anyone here, but there is, if you want to know what the British religion is, it's called the National Health Service. No politician on earth will knock the NHS. That is political suicide, because everyone believes in it. Because it is actually a religion that you can believe in. It looks after you from birth to death. It's something that captures the values. If you think about what a religion is for, it gives you a sense of being, it gives you a sense of values, and it's there throughout the whole of your life. And I think actually the NHS has kind of become that British religion. That it's in trouble. It's in trouble at the moment for all kinds of reasons. Politically, it's in trouble, but no one would ever kill it off. There's one party called UKIP, and as you're new to this country, you don't know really who these parties are really. And I'm an academic. I don't want to influence you at all in how you view these parties whatsoever. That would be absolutely wrong of me as an academic. But UKIP are also known as complete and utter nutters. And actually, they're the only party who said pretty bad things about the NHS, which is why they're not going to get elected. So that kind of is the religion in a strange kind of way. Here we have Great Britain, not the United Kingdom, not England, not Scotland, but Great Britain. The Olympics was really interesting because it celebrated the NHS, it brought pop culture in, it showed off British athletics in a rather spectacular way that no one possibly could predict before. I think it was all rigged, actually. I think they put something in the Americans' tea. It must have been, really. I mean, why we won those medals, I have no idea. No, I think it did very well. Fair competition and all that. But what was, I went along to a football match, because my son's into football. I'd rather watch paint dry myself, but he wanted to go and see South Korea versus Gabon. It was a goalless draw. And honestly, watching paint dry that day would have been a spectacular experience compared to the goalless draw between South Korea and Gabon. Good teams though they are, Good teams are there. But it was a wonderful experience for spectators, and everyone was saying at the Olympics, this is the best Olympics ever, just because of the experience of it. Everywhere that you went in London, there were people there helping you, even if you didn't want help, even if you weren't actually going to anything in the Olympic Games. Yeah, can I help you? Well, no, actually, no, go away. No. And there's thousands of volunteers taking part. London was transformed. It was a friendly, it was a happy, it was a joyous place, etc. Why was that? Well, because there were a team of experienced designers at the heart of it. There was, Axe, don't you? Right. There was an experienced design team who were designing the Olympic Games. Right? Design was at the heart of the Olympic Games. That was why it was a great experience, and that was why it worked. Final two examples I'm going to look at is this. And it brings us back to utopia, and it brings us back to utopia in the 21st century. This is the public library in Peckham, South London. Peckham is one of the poorest boroughs in the whole of the UK, actually. It's got the highest murder rate, one of the highest levels of unemployment, the highest levels of deprivation. Ironically, it's only about 2 miles away from the City of London, which has got all the wealth, but they've got all the deprivation and all the poverty. So they needed a new public library. And what they got was a piece of iconic architecture that won the Sterling Prize. And you think, well, why would that community need a piece of iconic architecture? What possibly, how would that help? Because the people designed it. The people were involved in this very open design process by the Will Alsop Partnership, where over the period of 2 years, they figured out exactly what a library in South London needed, because most of our libraries are built in the 1800s. Right? The world was a different place. This is a world where kids can't go home, right, because there's problems at home. They can only do their homework in a library. They can only have their tea somewhere out. Maybe allowing kids to have their tea, fish and chips in the library would kind of change the place, make it more used. It's one of the most popular libraries in Britain. And it's one of the most popular libraries in Britain because people, ordinary people, users, were involved in a co-design process that opened that up. So you've got some really positive and progressive people who are making use of all those principles of service design, experience design, and co-design, and involving ordinary people and users in the design process. And then two of my heroes I'm going to finish with, because again, the other thing about what's been happening in the 21st century as we move into it further is the development of service design, and I think a new vibrant utopianism, and a utopianism that is rooted in reality. And it's about taking a lot of these methods that come from lots of different places. Some of them have come from the corporate sector. Some of the methods that we all use come from Silicon Valley and how we design consumer electronics. But actually, if you are embedding them in a community development project in Stirling, or you're working with a health authority in Glasgow, you can make huge use of these methods, and you can use that to facilitate positive change that people want. The work that Snook has done, I think, has been nothing short of remarkable. They were the subject of a case study that was published last week by Lancaster University that was great. Lauren herself was on the cover. I was overjoyed last September when I picked up The Observer, which is the paper I get it's a UK-wide, it's actually part of the Guardian group, so I'm a Guardian reader. And there she is on the bloody cover of it. And I bought 4 copies. I didn't actually, just bought one. It's one, I buy 4 copies with you on the cover. But I mean, that sense of awesome pride that someone so early in their career can achieve so much. But my point to you is that many of you at the start of your career, I'm not taking anything away from Lauren, who was a wonderfully talented person, but you are all wonderfully talented people. And if you find, as she did, that thing where your confidence, your skill, and your passion comes together in perfect harmony, you could be on the cover. But it's finding that thing. It's finding those people, right, who are like-minded. Those people, these two found each other. They found each other across
on the internet.
On the internet. Could it be dogs? On the internet, everyone is a dog. There's a theoretical article about it. Anyway, I think it was dogs. So the point is finding like-minded people that can spark you, that can inspire you, but finding that confidence, finding that passion, finding that skill that brings all that together in focus. You are all capable of doing that, and that's what the future of design depends on. Okay? There's nothing you can learn from me or anyone else that's going to teach you that. You find that, you discover that. Finishing off, this is where we got to, really, and we've been exploring how, industry has an agenda in terms of design, has given us methods, has generated wealth on the back of design, and government at the same time has tried to direct design. Without government, we wouldn't have the art schools we have. Without the art schools we have, we probably wouldn't have some of this at the bottom. The service economy, the creative industries, have been a huge outlet for British design. They've given it its particular talent. As I said right at the start, we're a country that is forever falling apart. Never quite does it. It's been falling apart throughout my lifetime. There's always been a crisis. We had a civil war for 30 years of my life in Northern Ireland. People were blowing up town centres and pubs and stuff like that. People thought the UK was finished. We had one of the best political campaigns that I've ever experienced last year, which ended up with some fantastic open debate. 87% of the people voted. Okay, they weren't forced to vote. 87% of the people in Scotland voted on a referendum that they felt passionately on both sides about. And that's actually something that I'm particularly proud of, that we had this great debate. It's about ideals. Design always has to be about ideals, and it's about looking to those people that can put those ideals into focus and show us those connections between design, and to keep that sense of utopianism alive. We've always, on these islands, these weird, spectacularly weird islands, been telling ourselves stories about this utopia, news from nowhere, etc. But it's actually telling ourselves stories of how the world could be, and putting that into a framework of design, whether it's the design of a building or whether it's the design of fashion or whatever, is really important. We've covered a huge amount of ground, ladies and gentlemen, over a course of 2 hours. Do you have any questions? We're sorry that took longer than I thought.